Christ for the world we sing. The world to Christ we bring. With loving zeal, the poor and them that mourn, the faint and overborne, sin sick and sorrow worn, whom Christ doth heal. Christ for the world we sing. The world to Christ we bring. With fervent prayer, the wayward and the lost, by restless passions tossed, redeemed at countless cost from dark despair.
Hello, welcome to our Bible study. My name is Clint McElroy, and today we'll be in 1 Kings chapter 4. We will be meeting today at 10 a.m., so please join us if you can. If you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay home and enjoy the streaming service. We'll also be meeting at 9 a.m. for classes, so please join us for those if you can. You're welcome to join us in the auditorium to watch this class on the large screen there. We have these English Standard Version Bibles available from the World Bible School. If you'd care to have one, please contact our church office and we'll make arrangements to get you one. We have many on our sick list, so please review our bulletin for more information. As is our custom, we want to remember the story of the two men on the road to Emmaus who were joined by a third man on the way. When they got to their destination, that third man left their company after revealing himself to have been the Christ. After he left their presence, they realized there had been a burning in their hearts while he had been with them. It's that burning that they had in their hearts that we hope to kindle in our own hearts as we draw closer to the Lord through a study of His Word. We also want to remember the admonitions of Leviticus chapter 19, to be holy for the Lord our God is holy. And we want to remember the stories of Rehoboam, Jeroboam, and the prophet that came to Jeroboam, primarily in reflection of what to believe and when to believe it. We should always take these stories as cautionary about who to believe and when we should believe them when they come speaking in the name of the Lord. Take care not to believe those that might be bringing a message for selfish reasons or a misguiding lesson that would send us in the wrong direction. Certainly that was the case in the story of Jeroboam and the prophet that came to Jeroboam, more specifically. So we know that we should take very good caution in believing everyone who comes in the name of the Lord. And I would hope that you would take caution before listening to me and this presentation of this study this morning. If you see something in contradiction to what you understand in the Scripture from anything that I say, believe the Scripture. Don't trust me. Trust in what the Word says. And if you do find such a thing, I hope that you will contact me and let me know so that we can look together in the Word and see if we can come to a better understanding. I hope you'll join me now as we enter into this study of 1 Kings chapter 4, and that you will be edified from it. 1 Kings chapter 4, from the English Standard Version. King Solomon was king over all Israel, and these were his high officials. Azariah the son of Zadok was the priest. Elihoreph and Ahijah the sons of Shisha were secretaries. Jehoshaphat the son of Ahilud was recorder. Benaiah the son of Jehoiada was in command of the army. Zadok and Abiathar were priests. Azariah the son of Nathan was over the officers. Zabud the son of Nathan was priest and king's friend. Ahishar was in charge of the palace, and Adoniram the son of Abda was in charge of the forced labor. Verse 7. Solomon had 12 officers over all Israel, who provided food for the king and his household. Each man had to make provision for 1 month in the year. These were their names: Ben-Ur in the hill country of Ephraim, Ben-Decker in Makkaz, Shaalbim, Beth-Shemesh, and Elon Beth-Hanan, Beth-Heshid, and Aruboth. To him belonged Succoth in the land of Hepher, Ben-Abinadab, and all Naphthdor. He had Taphath the daughter of Solomon as his wife. Verse 12. Baana the son of Ahilud and Taanach, Megiddo, and all Beth Shean, that is, beside Zarethan below Jezreel, and from Beth Shean to Abel Meholah, as far as the other side of Jokmeam. Ben-Geber and Rehoboth Gilead, he had the villages of Jair, the son of Manasseh, which are in Gilead, and he had the region of Argob, which is in Bashan, 60 great cities with walls and bronze bars. Verse 14. Ahinadab, the son of Iddo, and Mahanaim, Ahimaaz, and Naphtali, he had taken Basemath, the daughter of Solomon, as his wife. Verse 16. Baana, the son of Hushai, in Asher and Baloth, Jehoshaphat, the son of Paruah, and Issachar, Shemiah, the son of Elah, and Benjamin, Geber, the son of Uri, in the land of Gilead, the country of Shahan, king of the Amorites, and of Og, king of Bashan, and there was one governor who was over the land. Verse 20. Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Verse 22. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, and 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowls. Verse 24. For he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates, from Tifsha to Gaza, over all the kings west of the Euphrates, and he had peace on all sides around him. And Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan even to Beersheba, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, all the days of Solomon. Verse 26. Solomon also had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. And those officers supplied provisions for King Solomon and for all who came to King Solomon's table, each one in his month. They let nothing be lacking. Barley also, and straw for the horses, and swift steeds they brought to the place where it was required, each according to his duty. Verse 29. And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and breadth of mind, like the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all other men, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahal. And his fame was in all the surrounding nations. He also spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts and of birds and of reptiles and of fish. And people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. Okay, so last time we read out of chapter 3 about Solomon's request of God. It starts with a short passage here. Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. So that one little passage there covers a massive amount of time. It took a long time for Solomon to finish building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. So this was not in line chronologically from the last chapter to this chapter. Continuing in verse 2, the people were sacrificing at high places, however, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. So now it already steps back a little bit and recognizes that during this part of the reign of Solomon, the temple was not yet built, and so the people were still going up to the high places to make their sacrifices. It says in verse 3 that Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places, just like the rest of the people. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there in verse 4, for that was the great high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask what I shall give you." And Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant David my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart towards you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this day. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father, although I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this your great people? So this all is in a dream that Solomon has having while he's up making sacrifices at the high place. And he dreams this thing that is actually occurring. God is actually presenting himself to Solomon in this dream to ask him these questions. And Solomon responds in this way, which is a very noble thing. It's very noble to have someone who can give you anything ask you what you want and say in return you want simply the ability to do the thing that you've been asked to do. That's a powerful thing to say, and he went on to be even more specific and ask for an understanding mind to do those things that he should do. Verse 10, it pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this, and God said to him, because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life or riches, or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right. Behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. And if you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. And Solomon awoke, in verse 15, and behold, it was a dream. Then he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. So this was a strange time, because most of the tabernacle was up at this high place, and he made sacrifices there that were according to the law. But then, once he had this dream and God made this promise to him, he came back to Jerusalem and worshiped where David had put the Ark of the Covenant in a tent there, waiting for the temple to be built, and made burnt offerings and peace offerings there as well. And was this an act of wisdom? I guess you could make the argument that having this wisdom from God brought him back to the tabernacle to do these sacrifices. I don't know. That might be a stretch. But having received this blessing from the Lord, now we see it put to the test. 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him, in verse 16. The one woman said, "O my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. Then on the 3rd day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth, and we were alone. There was no one else with us in the house. Only we two were in the house. And this woman's son died in the night, because she lay on him. And she arose at midnight and took my son from beside me while your servant slept, and laid him at her breast, and laid her dead son at my breast. And when I rose in the morning to nurse my child, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, behold, he was not the child that I had borne. But the other woman said, No, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours. The first said, No, the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine. So up until verse 21, this one woman is telling the story, and at that point, the other one responds in verse 22, right there standing in front of King Solomon. No, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours. And the other says back, No, the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine. So they were arguing there, even before the king, after they had presented this statement of the situation to the king. In verse 23 it follows, Then the king said, The one says, This is my son that is alive, and your son is dead. And the other says, No, but your son is dead, and my son is the living one. And the king said, Bring me a sword. So a sword was brought before the king, and the king said, Divide the living child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other. Then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, Because her heart yearned for her son, O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death. But the other said, He shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him. Then the king answered and said, Give the living child to the first woman, and by no means put him to death. She is his mother. And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. So what an incredible story of an exercise of wisdom, an exercise in identifying the liar, an exercise in discerning who truly had stakes in what was being presented before him. These are important things to learn as a lesson from this passage, but understand this was Solomon's wisdom. This is not going to come easily to anyone else. This kind of understanding of a situation and how to discern what is true in a situation where everyone has good reason to possibly tell you a story was, I think, unique to Solomon here, and we should respect that. But it's not that we can't learn from it and try to make application, but we must always remember our application is not rooted in the wisdom that he has. It's rooted in our own understanding of that wisdom, which may not measure up. But that said, what an incredible display of wisdom, what an incredible solution to the problem. He introduced an absurdity so great that, of course, anyone rationally understanding the situation would not want anything to do with it and would walk away rather than let that occur. And that's how he discerned who was telling the truth, who was rational here, and who was behaving irrationally for whatever reason. And I believe it was out of grief and jealousy that this other woman was acting. It's just an incredible story, and it's an incredible thing to have said of you that the wisdom of God is in you to do justice. And that, again, is a separate, I think, a lesson there. Solomon had requested wisdom from God for a very specific purpose, so that he could rule the people appropriately, and he was, in fact, doing that. He could have used that wisdom in any way he saw fit to maybe increase his wealth, or to acquire the affections of women, to acquire the affections of different people who had power in the land. And certainly we see that he did do those other things, but he did not do that to the exclusion of doing justice for his people. And that is an important thing to see here out of this passage. Moving on into chapter 4, we see a description of his new administration, which is very interesting. Some of the people that are listed here, it goes down through, and first and foremost, he identifies the priest as Azariah, the son of Zadok, and then he identifies his secretaries. Those would have been the people who went about making sure his day unfolded in certain ways. I'm not saying that these were secretaries like we think of secretaries. These were more like secretaries as people who managed their office, who managed the functionality of the government. They were probably the highest ranking people in the government other than the king himself. Then Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was recorder. This was the person who recorded all the information of the king's court and who wrote down the important things that the king said, the important actions that the king did, the important events that had taken place under his rule. All of those details were recorded each and every day, probably down to the minute, as they were being recognized. They were written down and recorded, as is done in any administration of any government. And most business offices, they keep track of the events that are going on. They keep track of the order of business. And that was the role that this Jehoshaphat played here. Of course, Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was in command of the army. Zadok and Abiathar were priests. These were, of course, the high priest, I believe here, not the personal priest of the king, which I think is the role that Azariah is taking in the earlier mention. Azariah, the son of Nathan, was over the officers. This is a different Azariah. Zabad, the son of Nathan, was priest and the king's friend. Ahishar was in charge of the palace, and Adoniram, the son of Abda, was in charge of the forced labor. And the forced labor was probably the household slaves, but it was probably also those who were forced to do service in order to work off a prison sentence or something like that. So it wasn't exclusively slave labor. This was an arrangement between probably even private groups to use the labor force from the prisons to do work, and then that's how they paid off their sentences. These are my suppositions and imaginings based on my understanding of the time. I'm not giving you a reference because I don't have one. That's my understanding of the way things worked at the time. Solomon, in verse 7, had 12 officers over all Israel who provided food for the king and his household. Each man had to make provision for 1 month in the year. So this is very similar to the way provisions were made for the temple. If you might have read out of one of the books of the law, the provisions were made by tribe. And so similarly, we have some of these broken down by tribe, and then others are broken down by geographical region, which may have had more to do with not just the tribal aspect of the people, but the way they interacted with local peoples of the land who had not been thrown out by the settling of the land earlier. And also those that had been subjugated afterwards by David and now lived under King Solomon, even though they weren't Israelites. So this was the way that they handled all that, and each one of those people is mentioned there, and I am not going to read their names again. It's interesting that some of these men who were in charge of the different months of the year for those provisions and the different regions were also married into Solomon's family by marrying his daughters, 2 of which are mentioned here in this passage. It's also wraps up with a description that's more like what I was talking about there at the very end of verses 18 and 19. That last little group of people there is mentioned as being not just a tribal group, but also Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. So we've heard of these locations before and how they had been subjugated in previous times. And so now they were under the rule of these regional areas. And so when it says there was one governor who was over the land, that's what I think it's saying. It's not saying that's one governor over all Israel. It's one governor over that region that was in this case comprised of Geber the son of Uri in the land of Gilead and the country of Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. So there was one guy, Geber, who was in charge of all of that area. Continuing in verse 20, Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. That's the people of those lands. And they ate and drank and were happy. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. So that's from the northeast of Israel to the northwest of Israel down to the southern borders of Israel with Egypt, what would become, I suppose, Judah later on. That would have been bordering Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. So that's important. So they were not without some autonomy, but they also brought tribute to Solomon, even though they had some ability to make decisions for themselves. It was all subject to the leadership of the Israelite overseer and then, of course, Solomon himself. Verse 22, Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour. I have here a reference that 1 core was about 6 bushels or 220 liters, and I still don't understand how much that is. So I would imagine it's quite a lot. So quite a lot of flour was used, and that would have been used daily for the provisions of bread and anything else that used flour. And 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, which is quite a lot, and then additionally 20 pasture-fed cattle. And I'm assuming these were slaughtered for meat, not used for milk or some other form of provision. So I think it's saying here that they actually slaughtered and consumed that many cattle on a given day. 100 sheep in addition to that, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl. So they had game animals as well as domesticated animals. For he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates from Tifsha to Gaza, over all the kings west of the Euphrates. And he had peace on all sides around him. And Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan even to Beersheba, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, all the days of Solomon. So just again reiterating that Solomon's time was a time of peace and prosperity for everyone. In verse 26, Solomon also had 40,000 stalls for horses for his chariots, which is a lot, and 12,000 horsemen. And those officers supplied provisions for King Solomon. So it's jumping back to the officers who were responsible for providing for provisions. It's not talking about the horsemen in that passage. So it jumps back from verse 26 to the previous statement about the officers who were responsible for provisions in verse 27. But it's an interesting number, 12,000 horsemen. That's a lot. So he had a large complement of military force to provide a defense for his country. That's an important thing. A lot of people think that just because God said there would be peace, there was peace, but there was also a provision for that peace made through a display of force, which did exist. So there was an army, a standing army, that did provide defensive positions for Israel. Now, it was still because God made peace that there was peace, but it is necessary to understand here that that's a large complement of chariots specifically, and horsemen in addition to that. The foot soldiers here are not mentioned. But going on, they made provision for King Solomon and all who came to King Solomon's table, each one in his month. They let nothing be lacking. Barley also and straw for horses, and swift steeds they brought to the palace. And swift steeds they brought to the place where it was required, each according to his duty. So here we see that there may have been a use of some of these animals for provisioning all through the region. So that's an interesting description there that may be read a little bit different than what you might read it otherwise, just one time through. But if they were in fact using the 40,000 stalls for horses, these horses for chariots to carry around provisions, that's an interesting use of that material support. So it's necessary to provide defense, but you also use that defensive force to make sure the provisions are moving through, so that commerce, to whatever level that commerce would be part of making provisions for the king, was also being conducted possibly through the provisioning of the army or the military defense. So that's all supposition on my part there, so there, it's worth what it's worth. Verse 29, God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and breadth of mind like the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all other men, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahal. So I don't know who the sons of Mahal were. Were Calcol and Darda and Heman sons of Mahal, or were Heman, Calcol, and Darda separate and apart from the additional sons of Mahal? I don't know the answer to that, and I don't really care. But it is interesting that these men are listed here. These men we do not know anything about. I don't know who these men are, but I do know who Solomon is, and that is telling in and of itself. And his fame was in all the surrounding nations. He also spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts and of birds and of reptiles and of fish. And people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So he was renowned throughout the world of his time. People came from all over to come hear of him, to come hear him, and we will see some of that as we read further going forward, both out of Kings and out of Chronicles. It is an incredible story. It's not the whole story, and we will, of course, read more about the role of Solomon and the things that he will achieve as we read going forward. But it is an amazing story, and these men were all part of his administration, and this was the function of his administration as described here. I hope you've had a word of encouragement in the things we've looked at today. Certainly is interesting to see how God makes provision of wisdom for Solomon, and to realize that he makes provision for us in the things that we need. How reassuring that is. We will be meeting this morning at 10 a.m., so please join us if you can. Hope to see you there. If you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay home and enjoy the streaming service. God bless and have a great week.